that leads to my favorite demographic talking point, which is that by 2040, we'll have more deaths than births in the country.
Right. Yeah. And obviously the relevance here is that if there are fewer births, there are fewer workers. If workers retire and they live longer, you've changed this ratio of what we call the worker to beneficiary ratio, which is so critical in predicting and estimating and realizing the cost of both the Medicare program and the Social Security program. I mean, you go back historically, there were roughly 3 workers for every beneficiary. We're now down to a little less than 2. Depending on how the demographics play out for fertility and mortality, we could have less than 2 workers going forward indefinitely in the future. And that makes it much harder to fund Social Security and Medicare if you've got only 2 workers paying the taxes to support those beneficiaries.
And, just now that you brought up Social Security, we only have about 2 minutes left, but I mean, really, we're Social Security is getting closer and closer to trust fund insolvency. So obviously in the ensuing 30 years, they really have not addressed that at all. And the situation really hasn't changed much from what was projected in 1994.
Yeah, I mean, well, actually, you could go all the way back to 1977 or 1983, and if you sort of look at the crossover point, at what point were the demographics going to shift? The baby boomers retire, and you would start paying out more than you collected. And even the earlier projections assume that somewhere around 2010, 2020, you would start running cash flow deficits, and that is in fact what has occurred. The only difference is we had unexpected surpluses after the 83 amendments. Those built up the trust fund a little more than was expected back in the early 70s. I'm sorry, the late 70s, early 80s. And they initially thought the trust fund would get us somewhere around till about the year 2050, but things have not played out as well as they had predicted in the early 80s after the 83 reform. And so we're now seeing, roughly for the last decade or so, the expectation was that the trust fund would be insolvent somewhere around 2035, and that's where we are today.
Yeah, and then if nothing happens, then you run into a benefit cut.
Yeah, the trust fund becomes exhausted, and the government doesn't have the legal authority to pay full benefits on time, and that means that beneficiaries would expect to some sort of across the board cut, or some people theorize that what would really happen is that they would get fewer checks. In other words, cash payroll taxes are still coming in, but there's not enough every month to pay benefits. So that means the checks would get delayed until you collected additional revenue, and then the checks would go out. So the idea would be that instead of getting 12 checks a year, you might only get 9 or 10 checks a year, which is effectively, effectively a benefit cut.
Yeah.
Even though your checks don't change, they come late.
Well, yeah, hooray, I got my check, and I don't get one next month. So
yeah, right, exactly.